So, welcome everyone to this teaching on Passover. Feel welcome to introduce yourself in the chat. You can say your name, your gender pronouns, where you're calling from, and one thing that you relate to about Passover, one thing you know or you love about Passover, or a question you have. This is going to be a little talk on Passover, just sharing some teachings around it, and then we'll have some time at the end for questions. But please, if there's anything I'm saying that you have questions on, feel welcome to write in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat as well. So feel welcome to kind of bring your voices into that. Passover is in a couple of days, which is very exciting. Passover in some ways is like the most climactical Jewish holiday of the year. It's one of three pilgrimage holidays. So, kind of the original core Jewish holidays that created the Hebrew calendar was Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. These were kind of the three main the pilgrimage holidays, right? When people would kind of come to Jerusalem, they would bring their offerings, and they would, these also, the three holidays also like marks the agricultural season, right? So Passover is kind of the beginning of spring, the beginning of the and Sukkot kind of marks the end, the harvest festival. So we're kind of getting this agricultural frame as our Hebrew calendar. Something that's also very interesting is that, spiritually speaking, these three holidays that are, kind of the core aspects of Judaism, they mark this triangulation of peoplehood, God/Torah, and then land. So Sukkot is the holiday that celebrates land, right? It's, where we dwell in tents and we kind of connect back to the land. Shavuot is about the revelation around the receiving of Torah, the receiving of direct wisdom, and that's the spiritual. And then Passover is about the liberation of peoplehood, right? It's about the community. It's about like the people. So we have kind of the people, God, and land triangulation that in some ways is kind of at the core of it. So as we're kind of approaching this holiday of Passover, we're really kind of getting into this space around peoplehood, right? The freedom of people and the beginning really of the Jewish people as a community, right? As a people and what that means. So Passover, really is about the story of Exodus, the liberation from Egypt, going from being slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt to being servants of God, right? That's kind of the big evolution that we do in Passover. So it marks, this telling of the story from Exodus, and there's so many kind of details in it. So we'll kind of get to that, but first we'll just kind of do an overall frame of like, what do we actually do when we celebrate Passover? So first, just about the name Passover. Passover can mean a couple of different things. So sometimes people translate it as Passover, right? That God passed over, which goes back to the story, right? That there was a story of the 10 plagues, right? That Pharaoh didn't allow the Israelites to leave and then kind of had his heart be hardened. So God kind of sent the plagues one at a time. And the last plague, the 10th plague, was around the killing of the firstborn. And what the Jewish people did is that they put a little blood on the top of their kind of door so that God would pass over. So that is in some ways one of the teachings of the name of Passover, that God literally passed over the Israelites' home and didn't kill the firstborns, and kind of protect, right? So a lot of the time people also think of Passover as also this kind of like protection-filled holiday. The other kind of thing about the name Passover is around the korban, the sacrifice, the Passover offering, right? So Passover is one of the pilgrimage holidays, which basically when the centralized temple in Jerusalem stood, people would come and gather and do a pilgrimage, and they would do, these big sacrifices, these big offerings. So there was the Passover sacrifice, which was a lamb offering, that, is also kind of part of the Passover experience. Okay, so we're really kind of getting into, part of the reason why Passover is so climactical and so important. I mean, I will share personally, for me, like growing up, Passover was this time where it was just like the whole family was there, like no question, right? It's like such an intense, like, teaching of peoplehood, because I remember it would just be like long tables, everybody's dressed in royalty, everybody's like coming with, their best outfits, getting new outfits for Shabbat, for Passover. And then everyone's kind of sitting around, and like you basically can't leave for 5 hours, because the Passover Seder, which is, the ritual marking of the night, is just so long. So, there's just like this very beautiful experience of this like really deep togetherness, right? And I remember all the time, like especially as a child, like the Passover clothes were my favorite, because there's kind of this teaching that you show up to the Passover Seder and you're supposed to kind of be like these free beings, right? Because it's a whole purpose is to contemplate our freedom, to contemplate our liberation. So we want to kind of embody that. So we come, right? Like for my Passover Seder this year, I said, dress for royalty and comfort, right? Because we want to be like in this royal atmosphere, but we also want to remember that we're leaning to the left. We have this whole situation of comfort. So the Passover Seder, which is kind of like the main thing that we do, right, is this ritual ceremony where we do different steps, and each thing kind of marks a ritual moment. We famously also have the Magid, which is, one of the aspects of the Seder, which is basically the telling of the Passover story. And, there's a teaching that says that even if you are very smart, very wise, very learned in the whole Torah, even if you know the Passover story like backwards and forwards, you still have to retell the story. You still have to come and share it. And I think that there's something that's really beautiful about that, because it shows that it's not about content, right? It's not about the content of the story, but it's about the experience of storytelling, which, we're supposed to do every year. And in some ways, this is so important to Jewish foundation, right? Is that we have this central story that we all gather around, and we tell it every year to every generation, right? We kind of keep on telling this story. And one of the reasons why we keep on telling the story, right? Because it's not actually about this historical moment that just happened this one time. It's actually about an ongoing process that is always happening, right? So every year, this teaching is relevant, and it's relevant both personally and internally, and also collectively and societally. So, this teaching around what does it mean to go from oppression to liberation, right? And there's so many different ways to address that, or to, have this conversation. This is why the Passover Seder is so long, right? Because this whole coming together around this examination of the process from oppression to liberation, that's a pretty big undertaking. So before we even kind of get to the Passover Seder, there's all this preparation that we have to do in advance, right? Because we can't just like show up to something like that. So Passover, is also very aligned with the beginning of spring, the beginning of sometimes it's called Chag HaAviv, the spring holiday. It's the first holiday actually of the Hebrew calendar year, because the Hebrew calendar technically starts with Nisan, right? It's very similar to the astrological year that starts with Aries, right? So we just started this new year. So Passover is really marking the first holiday. It's interesting because if we kind of look at that cycle of what happened before, right? Purim was the last holiday of the year. And Purim is in some ways this opposite holiday to Passover, because Purim is very much the chaos, there's not really a lot of order to Purim. You kind of end in the Piscean waters of the ocean, into the chaos, into the mystery, into the unknown. You're kind of completely surrendering, completely letting go. And then Passover comes and it's a completely different experience, right? Passover is actually like, okay, now we sit down, now we have an organized ritual, it's all about order. So you can also kind of look at this transitional time, right? We're really going from this level of chaos to this beginning of order, right? We're starting our new year with our order. So one of the big things that we do is that we start cleaning, right? Like the cleaning rituals are actually quite a big part of Passover. People start actually doing that right after Purim ends. People all of a sudden go home, they start like scrubbing their whole house, right? Because there's something about like, if the Passover Seder literally marks, right, this like freedom ritual, then we really want to cleanse everything from this last year, everything that no longer serves, right? So this external cleaning is actually mirroring this internal cleaning that we're doing. So, right, the teaching kind of goes that we have to rid our homes of chametz. Chametz is, right, the unleavened bread. It's basically, anything that has flour in it, or kind of those main flour or oats or thing like that. And we're supposed to kind of clear our home of that. But the chametz, right, it symbolizes more than just this physical thing. It's actually also the spiritual thing of like what no longer serves. Like, how can we shed this? How can we clean that out? So there's kind of these big rituals around doing this, the spring cleaning of not just the kitchen, right, but the whole home. And there's a ritual that we do the evening before Passover begins called Bdikat Chametz, which is one of my favorite rituals, where we kind of turn off the lights in all the rooms, and then we turn on a flame. And we basically, usually it's kind of also kid friendly. So you wrap the little bread in tinfoil and you hide it around the house. And then the parents kind of walk around with the light and they're trying to find the tinfoil bread things that the kids hid. And the reason why you're doing this is because it's kind of like this ritual where you really want to symbolize that you really did your due diligence, you checked your whole house, you are really like getting rid of all this chametz. And again, this is about the mirroring of the internal experience, right? The internal shedding. Like, we want to be very clear that like we did our work, we really cleansed, we like let go. Something that is really, really beautiful about, the Kabbalistic kind of orientation to Judaism is a lot of learning about letter plays and words and, how they all mix. So chametz, which is spelled with a chet mem tzadik, that's the word for chametz, right? For the forbidden, or the thing that we're trying to kind of limit or cleanse out for Passover. But if we look at matzah, right, which is mem tzadik hey, it's almost the same. They both have the mem and the tzadik, but what's different is that the chet turns into a hey. And the chet, I wish I had like a whiteboard behind me, but right, the chet is kind of like that. And the hey, it has all like an opening. And the hey is part of the names of God. So anytime we have a yud or a hey or a vav or an aleph, kind of the vowel sounds, we know that is a, thank you, Yael, for writing that in the chat, the chet and the hey, right? So we see that they're super, super similar, right? The chet and the hey, just what we have is now on the hey, we have an opening, right? And that opening, the hey, also symbolizes this godly presence, a divine presence. So this is also part of what we're doing, right? We're kind of cleansing ourselves of the chametz, and we're kind of going into the matzah. We're going into this place that has an opening for the divine presence. So I thought that was a really beautiful play and the connection of those words. Okay, let me see what else. Okay, so the matzah is really, so, for Passover is a holiday that is really lasts 7 days. In the diaspora, some people celebrate it for 8 days. But really it's supposed to be this holiday, right, where we're limiting ourselves. It's kind of like this dietary cleanse that we're doing. it's a gluten-free cleanse, like who knew that that was going to become the most in thing, right? But we're really kind of letting go of eating the bread. I mean, matzah technically also has gluten, but we're going in eating the matzah. And, it's interesting because the matzah is said to be this very unleavened bread that the tradition says that the Israelites, right, they were running out of Egypt and they didn't have enough time to kind of make this, allow for the bread to rise. So what was left was just 18 minutes of making the matzah, 18, of course, because we're Jewish and that's the number for chai, that's the number for life. So the matzah is kind of like this flat kind of almost cracker. And we kind of took that, right? So it's supposed to represent that we were kind of leaving in a rush. We left Egypt in a rush, right? But it's also supposed to kind of represent the limitations, right? It's Passover kind of is like this, it's a little bit of this game, because on the one hand, it's like we want to kind of enter this like royalty feel, right? We're liberated people, but we also want to remind ourselves of like the oppression in Egypt and like actually what happened there. And the matzah kind of represents that, right? It represents the limitations, the restrictions. We also have the maror, right? The bitter kind of herbs that we have. And so we have like throughout the Passover Seder, we have all these kind of ways that we're trying to also remember, have an embodied remembrance of that oppression. So, that's part of what the matzah represents. Passover being one of the kind of the big holidays, kind of like Sukkot, has a similar situation where the first days are seen as Yom Tov, the first and last days, right? Yom Tov meaning a day of, literally means good days, but it's kind of like days like Shabbat, where we're supposed to refrain from work, technology, all of that. And then in the middle, we have the Chol HaMoed days. We have the days where you're allowed to, do basically whatever you want, but they're still kind of seen as this in the frame of the Passover. So it's very customary for people to kind of go hiking, some people work, but honestly, like, I feel like we should all stop working as much as possible, especially on these holidays, right? And not just think of Passover as just a Seder day, but actually it's actually like a 7-8 day experience, right? So like whatever you're doing this year for the Seder, maybe you can also kind of elongate that process to the days in between and seeing like, okay, what are some practices, what are some rituals I can do for myself? Something that I'll share with you that I usually do on Passover that I really like is that, right, because one of the main teaching is that we're going not just, sometimes the Western view of freedom is very much about like, do whatever you want, right? Freedom is do whatever you want. But that's actually not what spiritual freedom is, because running after your desires that's not freedom. That's actually, you're just like bound to your own desires. So spiritual traditions teach that freedom is actually about knowing who you serve, right? Is about being a humble servant to God, which, right, in Jewish tradition, Moses was kind of like the one who represents that for us, which is why he's so big in this Passover Seder. So we're not going from being servants to Pharaoh to just getting to do whatever we want, right? But we're going from being slaves to Pharaoh, right? And again, the Hebrew is very beautiful because it goes from being avdei paro, being slaves to Pharaoh, to being avdei Hashem, to being a servant of God, right? From being a slave to being a servant, right? That is this whole transition. And it's from like, slave to Pharaoh to servant of God. So we're still in service, but just the dynamics are completely different. So this huge part of this Passover story is about, really kind of returning to God and knowing whom we worship. And being in connection that way. One really interesting thing to note is that the Haggadah, which is really, right, the telling of the Passover story that we have that we read during the Seder, it actually doesn't mention Moses' name once, which is really interesting because Moses is like our prophet, right? He's a key character in the Exodus story. But we actually don't see his name at all. It's actually more about God, right? About God kind of going to Egypt and liberating the Israelites. So there's a lot of really interesting things there about Moses and his role to this Passover story. Okay, let me see if there's any other things I want to share before I'll open it up to questions. Yeah, so after Passover, where we are in the Hebrew calendar, right? So Passover is kind of the first holiday. And then it also begins this period of the counting the Omer, right? Which starts the second day of Passover, which is basically this time in the biblical days. It was about these agricultural counting, the counting between the barley harvest to the wheat harvest, right? So from, this is an agricultural perspective, but really it's counting, right, the transition from Passover to Shavuot, right, 7 weeks of that. And this is in some ways, this deeper teaching. Shavuot is my favorite holiday because it's really about this direct revelation of God's wisdom. And one of the teachings that we have there is that Passover is really celebrating our physical freedom, right? Passover is about the external conditions shifting and that liberation, that physical liberation that comes. But, as we see kind of in the Bible, once there is that physical liberation and the Israelites are freed from Egypt, it doesn't mean that their internal reality actually is that much different, because the internal reality is something that you have to cultivate through the spiritual lens. So this is why, right, the Israelites are wandering over and over and over in the desert, because they're not yet ready. They haven't let go of the slavery mindset. They haven't let go of the oppression dynamics. So they can't be prepared for true spiritual freedom. So the 7 weeks that we have between Passover and Shavuot is also this time that we get to, mark and transition, like, okay, like what is this evolution between physical freedom to spiritual freedom? Because Shavuot is really this spiritual freedom, right? It's the direct wisdom, it's the Torah, it's like all of that. Passover is the physical and the spiritual, and then we get to go on that journey. And both are important, right? Both the physical and the spiritual, they're both aspects of liberation that are necessary. But, Passover, it also kind of marks this beginning of a liberation journey that, starts with commemorating, this experience of the Exodus story, but very much it's about the culmination in Shavuot around, right? There's so many different ways we can think about what Shavuot is, but Shavuot is really about this intimacy with God, right? It's about revelation. It's about like connection. It's about really returning to God in that way. So, Passover really marks this beautiful, beautiful journey there. One of the things that also happens on Passover is that we read a Megillah. There's 5 Megillot in the Bible, which are basically, these shorter books that are read on different holidays. So for Passover, on Shabbat of Passover, we read the book of Song of Songs, which is so beautiful, because Song of Songs is a book about this unity and it's this like love poem between God and the Jewish people, right? So going back to the theme of like peoplehood, right? This is really about us as Knesset Israel, sometimes it's called, right? The community of Israel. So this is really, this celebration of us as peoplehood. So we're reading this book, Song of Songs, which is really like, right, this love poem of like the whole people and God and what that kind of resembles. So there's a lot of beauty in reciting that song as well. Last thing I'll share, and then I'll open it up to questions or anything that folks want to share about Passover, is that one of the things that I think is so beautiful about so many Jewish rituals is that most of them, even though we have our synagogues and we have our congregational spaces and all of that, the core of so many Jewish holidays actually happen in the home space. Like, I think that's something that's so beautiful and actually fairly unique. And when we're looking at different religions, right, is that there's so much emphasis on the home, right? The cleaning of the home, of the meal, of the, the things that are happening in the home space, right? There's so much rituals there. So, it's and like welcoming people into the home, into the meal. That's such a core part of that experience. And yeah. Okay, so let me pause there and see if there's any questions or any reflections or anything that folks want to share about anything I mentioned. And feel free to just raise your hand or unmute. Yeah, Carly.
Thanks, Hadar. As always, this is so beautiful. Knowledge, wisdom producing. 2 questions about, the first one connects to your Purim teaching and how you taught us that for the Megillah and Purim, God's name is not mentioned, I believe. And so I was wondering if you could tie that into the emphasis of God's name in the Passover Megillah. And then my other question was about Passover starting on Shabbat this year, I believe. It starts on Friday. And if you have any juicy insights to share about that.
Yeah, great questions. I love these questions. Yeah, that's awesome. Actually, I love that. I never thought about that. In the Purim Megillah, right, God's name's not mentioned. And then in the Passover Haggadah, it's all about God, right? So we're seeing, again, this dynamic. And I see in Bala also, you wrote in the chat around this connection between Passover and Purim and Shavuot, right? This is, one of the main teachings that I would love to offer the Jewish community about relationship to holidays is that holidays, they're not these one-time events, right? They're actually about processes, and they each connect so deeply to the holiday that came before and the holiday that comes after, right? Because it's about the rhythms and the cycles that were, the Hebrew calendar and the cycles of that are supposed to mirror in some ways an internal process. So we can't just like look at it as discrete values, right? Like, okay, this is my Passover experiences, but like each holiday, I mean, it's so beautiful. They really have these like transitional phases, right? There's this between Purim and Passover is one of the biggest ones, right? Because we're also kind of coming into a new year. So it's really about these relationships. And, between Passover and Purim, around this connection to God, I mean, it's so interesting. I feel like I have to think more about that. But I think that what I would say is that part of what the teaching there is to really know that God is both, right? God is both in the absence of the name of God, just like in the story of Esther. But God is also through, right? God is also through the visible, through the miraculous, right? Passover is so much about miracles, right? Nisan, the Hebrew month of Nisan, which the month of Passover, comes from Nes, which means miracles, right? So it's actually like sometimes, the Purim story is very much about like human agency in a way, right? Esther's agency of like doing things, even though God was hidden, we knew that God was playing. But Passover is very much about like, no, God comes and actually does the miracles. So I would say that part of it is kind of like opening up to the both, right? That God is in the both. God is both in the hidden and God is in the visible. So Passover is very much highlighting God in the visible, right? God who parts the seas, God who, can make these supernatural things come to be, which honestly, I feel like is a great way to start the year, right? With a miraculous, anything is possible kind of framework, which, one of the things I'm working on now is really developing an understanding of abolition from a Jewish perspective. And I think that, Passover is very in line with that, right? This understanding of miracles, because what is really a miracle, right? A miracle is actually about, I mean, there's a couple of different ways you can think about a miracle, but one way is thinking about it as something that you did not think was possible becomes possible, right? So it's not actually, because our reality by definition is based on our perception. So all of a sudden, when something that seems impossible becomes possible, that is a miracle. And I think that there's so much to translate about that in the justice world, right? Because so often it's like we can't even imagine like a world without policing. We can't even imagine all these things. But this is exactly the spiritual tool that we need, right? Abolition is actually about how do we imagine other ways of governing society, and that imagination is actually what helps make it possible. If we can't even imagine that, right, like it can't come to be. So I think these practices of, right, like miracles, of playing with what's real, of playing with our perception, our experience, all of that is very alive. And there's a reason why it's very deeply connected to this question of justice, right? This question of going from oppression to liberation, because part of what we're needing from oppression to liberation, right? It's literally two huge different mentalities. If we're just talking about the internal process right now, the process of being in the dynamics of oppression, in order to really free from that and go into this dynamic of liberation, it is a miracle. Like, it's truly a miracle. And the miracle is that we're really like shifting frameworks in such fundamental ways that it's, like literally like allowing for our whole systems to rewire, which is what the Israelites were doing in the desert for 40 years. So I think it's like, the miracles, the desert, the things that make these radical shifts possible, right? This is part of where we're in the playground of for Passover. In terms of this question about Shabbat and Passover fall, yeah, it's like super beautiful alignment this year. To, in some ways, the holiest things in Judaism coming together, this beautiful union. Yeah, I don't know that I have much to say other than it's like really, really deep, that connection, and that this double celebration that we're going to have, and that hopefully, sometimes when the Passover Seder like falls on like a Tuesday, maybe some people work the next day or they don't really know how to take off or whatever it is. But now we kind of have, this whole Shabbat to rest into that, to kind of really allow for ourselves to come into Passover with this intention of like immersion into it, and allowing to have the rest after this Passover Seder, so we don't feel like we have to rush to anything after. And yeah, I think that there's, going into back to that teachings of like the miracles, it's like Shabbat, right? Shabbat is me'en olam haba. Shabbat is from the world to come. It's about what the world can be, right? It's about this liberated view of what is possible. And I think Passover, right? Passover is really about the memory, right? Going back into the memory field around what was it like going from oppression to liberation, and how can we put ourselves into that story? Because again, this is not something that just happened to our ancestors years ago. This is something that happens in every generation, where the dynamics are different, but every generation has to go through a transition like that. Another way of saying that is every soul actually has to go through that, right? No soul is exempt from that. Every human being has to go from a process of being, sometimes people say Mitzrayim is the tsar, right? The narrow places, going from the narrowness into the expansiveness. Like mina metza karati ya, like from the narrow straits I called to ya, I called to God, right? To the expansiveness. So, this process of going from the narrow straits to the openness, this is, we all have to do that. And Shabbat becomes our compass around like where we're trying to aim for, like what is that representation of this liberated world, a world where everybody has access to rest and pleasure and joy, so and free from all of the binds. So I think there's something nice there to connect about that. Can you share about the Yud? What did I say about the Yud? Tell me again.
I don't remember. That's why I'm asking.
There was one of the letters that symbolizes, when you were talking about Hey, you were saying that Hey, Yud, and I forget the other ones, Vav.
That's Avi.
Yeah. So this is it's actually very interesting, because it's in some ways kind of similar in Arabic and actually in a lot of other languages, but the vowels letters have a special significance And especially, right, so in Hebrew, the vowel languages, the vowel alphabet, vowel letters, sorry, I'm like, vowel letters, right? The Yud, the He, the Vav, and the Aleph. Yud, He, Vav, He obviously is the name of God, but Aleph, which stands for Elohim, is also part of that. And it's also, a vowel letter. So the vowel letters, anytime we have vowels, they kind of signify God, right? Like, let's see a couple examples. Like even like, right, like Adam ve'adama, right? Adam is human being, Adama is earth, but we see Adama is like human with a hey at the end. So anytime we see like a hey at the end, that kind of signifies that there's a deeper divine presence there. And same thing, right, with the Yud and the Aleph and the Vav. It's kind of like thinking about it like the breath of God, right, which is the vowels. And whenever we see that, we know that there's kind of this thing. So I think I was sharing mostly about the chametz going into the matzah, the chet going into the hay. So we have the little opening in the hay, right? We have a little bit more expansion. The chet is kind of like solid and there's no room, but the hay, all of a sudden there's an entrance. I don't know if I said anything particularly more about the yud, but yeah, it's part of the holy letters of the vowels. Yeah, Akiva.
I was wondering if you could say more about the connection between Passover and spring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, in the ancient Near East, it was actually so one of the ways that tribes would distinguish themselves is by how they mark time. Like that was kind of, I don't know what the parallel is to the nowadays. Nowadays, it's like people are like, what astrology sign are you in or whatever it is. But back then it was very much like, what's your calendar system, right? Like, how are you marking time? Are you using the sun and the moon? Are you just the sun? Are you just the moon? Like, what's the vibe? And most tribes actually would do a blend of the sun and the moon. Actually, a lot of those calendars are not really ones that are still in use. And we see, right, the Gregorian calendar year is very sun-based. The Islamic calendar year is lunar-based. It's only by the moon. And the Hebrew calendar, it's a mix. It's a mix of the sun and the moon. It's probably, I would say, more lunar-based. But part of the thing that we have, right, because like in the Islamic calendar, that is purely lunar, we see that Ramadan, it can happen at any month because it just goes by the cycle of the moon. So it can be in the spring, it can be in the winter, right? It shifts every year. But in the Hebrew calendar, because the roots of so many of the holidays were agricultural, even though we're going by the moon, right? Passover is on a full moon. It's actually the third of the series of full moon holidays, right? So we started with Tu B'Shvat, which was a full moon of Shvat, Purim, which is a full moon of Adar, and now we have Passover, which is the full moon of Nisan. So it's like 3 full moons in a row. So, we're seeing kind of that moon counting, but we also want to basically fixate the agricultural seasons, which is basically the rhythms of the sun, right? The sun goes by the agricultural season. So it was very important to connect because Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, right? They're kind of the holy 3 of the agricultural season. It was always very important that Passover was in the spring because Passover, right? It's like also the renewal. It's like the new energy, the new year, the new everything. So this is why Passover, part of what the Hebrew calendar did is that they fixated a leap year every 3 to 4 years. So we were just in a leap year this year, right? We had 2 Adars, and that basically what that made sure of is that Passover would be in line with the spring. Because think about it, if we didn't have the additional Adar this year, Passover would have started like a month ago, which we still would have not fully been in spring. So we kind of did this techniques to help make sure that there's this connection. Spiritually, I would say what the connection is between the springtime, right, is because we're in this place, yeah, of renewal, right? It's also kind of like this cleanse. Like for me, sometimes it's like, I don't know if I'm doing things because of like the energy of it, if it's because of the Hebrew calendar of it. But yeah, the last 2 weeks, I found myself just like wanting to get rid of things, wanting to cleanse, right? Because as we're kind of opening into this energetic new year, into the spring energy, there's kind of like this immediate, like, okay, yeah, like what no longer serves? How do I let go of that? How do I come into this new way of being, right? And, there's also all these teachings. The first commandment in the Torah is about Rosh Chodesh, is about marking time, which actually happened right after the Exodus, which is just fascinating that's the first commandment, is to basically be free enough so we can mark our own time, so we can actually like have our own rituals around time. And, this is part of, a lot of commentators talk about how this is the huge difference between someone who's a slave and someone who's a free person, right? The free person actually has complete agency of their time. They are able to just completely, organize their time as they want. And the person who's a slave is completely dependent on other cycles of time, right? They cannot interact with time in their own way. So I think that there's something there that's really interesting too, right? As we're kind of marking this spring energy, which is kind of like this newness, right? We're coming into a new year. We're starting with this liberated perspective from like, okay, like freedom, we want our agency back over our time, right? Especially now that we're kind of in some ways energetically designing the rest of our year ahead. We kind of want to come at that from that free perspective. And again, like the teachings of Passover are also so much about memory, right? Because it's like, even as we're moving into the spring, into the renewal, right? We're starting with sharing an ancient story, right? Which is, again, just in some ways, maybe the paradox of it is like, we're going forward, but we're also going backwards at the same time. Yeah, that would be my answer to that.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I see a question in the chat. Curious about bitters and how they came to the Seder plate, as well as the medicinal use of bitters for cleansing toxins from the body and dealing with trauma and its symbolism, as you have said, as embodied representation for slavery. Yeah, beautiful. That's a really beautiful question. I love how that was phrased. Yeah, because I think, one way I'm just starting to think about Passover this year is about like really like a digestive cleanse, right? Like what would it look like to think of this as like a purging or a detoxifying way of just, from the body's perspective, which in some ways I think it is what's going on. I really like that connection between the bitters, right? The bitter herbs that we do to clean the toxin, and the bitters that we have on the Passover Seder. I do think that there's a connection there for sure. There's something about kind of like that burning, right? That burning from the inside that we're kind of trying to go for, which is, very similar to the bi'ur chametz, right? We're literally, after we do the bdikat chametz, after we kind of search for the chametz, the next morning we're supposed to kind of take it out and burn it, right? So there's something about that burning and that relationship to the detoxifying, that purging, that releasing. It's also taking place during like the Aries season, which is the fire sign, right? We're like literally burning the things. So I think that there's definitely this connection there. And yeah, in terms of like that, the Passover Seder, it's like, it's filled with these moments of just like, okay, like, yeah, let's remember this, let's remember that. Like, what did that feel like? Like my family, my Kurdish side of the family, they did this ritual where they, everybody would like dress up as the Israelites who left Egypt, right? Like, walking around with like all the heavy, like, things you were carrying with you and being like, oh, I traveled so far, and just kind of having this embodied theatrical play with it, which I think is very much about, there's so much to kind of contemplate here about Passover being this somatic memory experience, right? Ritual experience. I mean, I love that phrase. Passover is a somatic memory ritual experience, right? Yeah. Any other questions or comments or reflections?
I wanted to say I've been trying to prepare for Passover, and it's my first Passover, and I kind of realized, like, when I was reading about like all the traditions, that I think it's like a huge undertaking to do the Seder myself. I wanted to have one like for me and my friends, and I still do, but I'm kind of overwhelmed like by the idea of like trying to do it all. And I know I just still want to, but I'm like, do you have any tips or advice?
Yeah, great question. I know Passover is like so overwhelming. You're like, I have to make a Passover offering, I have to go to Jerusalem, to the temple, give a whole thing. Yeah, for sure. It's a long Seder. There's a lot of things to do. I mean, first I would just say that it's like, you don't have to do it all, right? And especially like one of the things that I think is so beautiful about the Jewish holidays is that they come every year, right? So it's like each year we connect in a new way, we connect in a deeper way, we learn something different, right? And it keeps evolving, right? This is kind of evolution, is that we do something, then we give it time, and then we come back to it, and then we see how it changed. So we're going to kind of continue doing that, hopefully for the rest of our lives, right? Passover is always going to be at the same time, like full moon around this time. So, you know, we don't have to get ahead of ourselves around just like, I need to now go from 0 to 100, right? Like maybe you just start with having some matzah and then just like reading a couple of parts from the Magid, right? Making it simple. Maybe it's about, you know, then there's a lot of really beautiful guides. Maybe it's just about choosing a Passover guide that works for you. And just kind of being, you know, gentle and not having to feel like you have to do it all. And also like allowing, you know, I feel like so often, especially with tradition and religious things, it's like people really want to do it, which is awesome, you know, that's great. But part of the things that we also have to remember is that the tradition is it's an alive tradition. It's not something that's just written in books and then we read the books and then we do it. The tradition is alive, meaning that you hosting people and you bringing people, even if you didn't prepare anything at all, and people just come and you just ask people questions, right, about Passover. And this is part of the somatic memory ritual experience. I'm going to start using that as for Passover, right? Is that like, even though we might not know the whole Torah, even though we might not know this whole rituals that we do, there's something that our bodies know. There's something about this, you know, this tradition that is alive through our bones, that just showing up allows for whatever needs to happen. So it's just like, you know, it's like we want to remember that the tradition is both, it's in the books and it's in the body. It's in both. It's in both of us together. So we don't have to, you know, try to like go to all the books and find all the details. That will come with time if we wanted to, right? Famously, right, there's a teaching around, you know, halakha, around Jewish law. Actually, it's exactly in some ways your question, right? This person is like, how am I supposed to learn it all? There's so many things, like, I can't do this. And then the rabbi goes to him, he's like, don't worry, just learn 2 a day, just like you were, you know, learning to walk, basically, just do 2 a day. And then, you know, one day you'll wake up and you'll be like, wow, like I've actually learned it all, right? So it's about that. It's about finding the rhythm that is sustainable for you. It's like starting small, but just doing it consistently. Yeah, I'm glad that was encouraging. Okay, any other questions, comments?
Carly asked in the chat if there's any guides you may recommend specifically.
So there's this website, Haggadah Deck, right? Do people know about that? Haggadah Deck, is that what it's called? You can basically design your own Haggadah, and they have like, I'll put it in the chat so you can see it. I'll also send it up in a following. email. Yeah, no, maybe it's just Haggadot. But yeah, they have basically a bunch there. It kind of depends on what you're looking for, right? If you're looking for something that's more spiritual, something that's more justice, something that's more ritual, something that's more, you know, you can kind of choose, but you can also kind of make your own and kind of take the parts you like from different Haggadot. So that's like a really fun one. And yeah, you can kind of look through and see which ones stick out for you there. Yeah. One day, inshallah, maybe I'll write one and then you can have, I'll recommend that. Okay, any other questions? Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much for coming to this Passover class. Hope you have a really beautiful Passover journey and experience this year, however you celebrate, however you mark this sacred holiday, the sacred holiday that is unifying with Shabbat this year. I hope it's so supportive for your liberation journey, both personally and collectively, and for deepening and learning about your relationship to yourself, to community, to God. I'll share with you all an email. Sorry for the mix up with the time. If anybody got confused with the Zoom link, I don't know what happened there, but I'll share the recording with you all. There's also an upcoming class that I'm having that is marking this transition between Passover and Shavuot, which is really all about, right, this spiritual growth time. So every week we're gonna basically look at a different spiritual quality, like faith and courage, discernment, things like that, and then practice different ways that we can cultivate that. So if you're interested in kind of being in a container between Passover and Shavuot around some spiritual learning, I'll share also info for that. This class is free / by donation. So if you feel moved to make a donation, I'll also send my Venmo and PayPal information. And that is all. Hope you have a really lovely rest of your day and really beautiful week. Also preparing, I invite everybody to, you know, this is something that I like think about, is that sometimes with a ritual, it's not just the ritual, there's like the before, there's a during, and there's the after. So, you know, maybe there's a way that we can also think about what are we doing before, what are we doing during, and what are we doing after with our Passover experience. So thank you so much and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.